Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. We have a lot of stories to cover as usual, but let's start with David Benatar. Last year, David Benatar had given a talk in University of Toronto talking about preponderance of injustice. The idea was that there is a vast amount of injustice in the world compared to justice. There were some criticisms to that. People argued that even though that would be the case, there is also a lot of justice present in the world. Many people do what they ought to do, and many people do not do what they ought not to do. Those things have been ignored, was the central criticism of that talk. David Benatar is going to respond to those criticisms on this new talk again in the University of Toronto, again in-person event, and it'll be on April 8th, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. of course local time in Larkin 200 room in University of Toronto. Now, these are all in-person talks. Last time when I had written to them, I had asked if the recording would be available, and they had said this work would be available to general public at a later point in time. After seeing this, I have sent them another email asking if that recording or that work is now available for us to access. I got an out-of-office reply saying that whoever that coordinator is out until 11th of March. So I would be following up again after 11th March to ask for the old recording as well as whatever happens here. But if you happen to be in this region and if you want to go there to attend this in-person event, please let me know. I would be interested to know what was being talked about and what happened. There was a new podcast by somebody called Magnetic Speeches or Magnetic Subjects podcast on the title of David Benatar on non-existence and antinatalism. It looks like it was in the Turkish language, so I could not understand what was being said, but I translated the abstract of the podcast, and it looks like they're asking all the relevant questions. Should we exist? Should we reproduce? Should we have children? Should humans exist? What is David Benatar saying on the subject? What is people like Jean-Paul Sartre are saying on the subject, and so on. So by the looks of it, this Magnetic Speeches podcast seems to be very interesting, but it was in Turkish, so I could not understand. So if anybody can help me summarize what was being discussed, it'd be very nice. Please let me know. The Antinatalism Advocacy newsletter for the month of March was out on 4th of March. As you can see on the screen, it included the references to 2 podcast episodes. One was Why Not to Eat Animals. It was an interview with Ash Wickety. We've also talked about in one of the episodes of Antinatalism this week. And then the interview with Seb Alex about humans and other animals. And then there is also a small little haiku by Dan Dana. Dan Dana was also interviewed on one of the episodes of Exploring Antinatalism podcast. He writes nice little haikus, many different haikus on antinatalism. One of them is published in this newsletter, as you can see. And then they are also saying that they are reviewing the website, the Antinatalist Advocacy website, to see if the information is correct and to the point and so on. So if there is any feedback, they have given a contact page, contact us link. That was the newsletter. If you have not subscribed, please go on and subscribe to Antinatalist Advocacy newsletter. There are 2 European organizations. Their names are too long to say out loud, so I'm just going to read them out. One is European Association of the Study of Science and Technology, EASST, and the other one is Society for Social Studies and Sciences, 4SS. And they seem to have a collaboration, and they do a conference once every 4 years. That conference is going to happen in 2024. The key dates for that are the conference itself is happening from 16th to 19th of July. 2024, and the registration dates for that conference start from 25th of March until 3rd of June. They have invited many panels and presentations for that conference, and I've looked into submissions of that conference. There were 2 interesting submissions related to antinatalism, which I'm going to talk about. The first submission is slightly lighter. It is studying the connection of the application TikTok and the Childfree movement. What it tries to study is how is the child-free movement, the individuals involved, all those child-free people, how are they connecting and how is TikTok enabling these connections. It also talks about how TikTok provides a ground for these child-free people to express themselves, and also talk about different aspects of child-free in terms of avoiding pregnancy, the technologies to use avoiding pregnancy, the contraceptives used, and so on, as well as some aspects of antinatalism too. So an interesting study, connection of TikTok to Childfree. There's one irony, I don't know if the authors of this paper or study know, that India, which is the most populous nation in the world today, bans TikTok. So there is no way for them to use TikTok to connect on the scale that people in other countries can. That's a bit of an irony, but nonetheless, this seems to be an interesting topic of study which will be presented in one of the panels in the conference probably. So interesting to know what happens there. The second one is slightly serious. It talks about the practices and discourses of non-reproduction, and they want to check out what infrastructures of population control are available from an antinatalist point of view, or at least a non-procreationist's perspective. One point to note is that it says that our panel invites empirically informed contributors on historically and geographically distributed sites, meaning across the world probably, social worlds and communities of practicing non-reproduction. The situated knowledge is produced, the content produced, and the controversies fought out. So this itself, in this sentence itself, has so many aspects, so many interesting aspects to look forward to about antinatalism. So hopefully it'll be interesting as well. There was a news on this bnnbreaking.com that UK launches therapy groups for the voluntarily child-free amid falling birth rates. So there's this lady called Haley Watkins, I think that's her photo probably, and she has started Cactus Counseling as a support therapy group for people who are voluntarily child-free by choice. And you might say that this is child-free news, what has this to do with antinatalism? But these sorts of efforts and initiatives would help making antinatalism, at least making not having children, a normal thing, in normalizing antinatalism. And therefore, even though technically this might be a child-free initiative, this should be appreciated even from an antinatalist's point of view. There was an article on theblaze.com with the title "The First Rule of Building a New Society: Be Fruitful and Multiply" by John Stokes. This is a very pro-natalist article. I want to go through some specific sections and arguments made in the article. You can question why to build a new society in the first place. But given that if you want to build a new society, what should be the first rule? What should be the one commandment that you should follow? That is what the article is talking about. So the proposed one commandment in this article is be fruitful and multiply and fill the entire solar system and subdue it. That is the one commandment that you should follow if you want to do a new startup society. But it is not explained why we should be doing that. Of course, if you want to start a new society, you ought to have children, you need to be fruitful and multiply, that's sort of given. But why fill up the whole solar system, and why to subdue it? What does it even mean to subdue it? This is not explained. Secondly, why only solar system? Why not go beyond that? Why stop at the boundaries of solar system? What even does the solar system mean in this case? Because solar system can mean many different things depending on your perspective. Does it just mean the 9 planets, the last orbit of 9th or 10th planet, if you want to count Pluto and all? Or does it mean the outer solar system, the Wood cloud and all the comets that are revolving around sun? Solar system is quite big than just these planets. It's a very complex system. So it just glosses over all these complexities. Why not just Earth? Why not just stop at the boundaries of Earth? That is also another question. And what does it mean by subdue, and why subdue? These are the questions which immediately come up when you read this rule, but it is not explained at all. Let's go further. The author says, I like this commandment for a few reasons. So again, he's not saying why they are good, he's just saying why he likes. One of the reasons is, as a pro-natalist, a father, and an anti-antinatalist, I rate this commandment 5 stars, which is just a statement without any basis. Then he says that it's a universal commandment by design and tradition. So by universal, he means it applies to all humans. So it does not include other species. You can question what's so special about humans. So in that way, it is not in fact universal, because universal would mean accommodating or applying to all beings, at least all sentient beings, all living beings in the universe. But no, it's just to humans. Many different kinds of people from religious and secular traditions could sign up for this. Okay, so that's as far as it can go, but you should be human. That's the criteria. Next, it comes to me through tradition, which is just appeal to tradition really, and of Christianity. Again, then how is that universal? if it is Christianity, or maybe you can expand it to Abrahamic religions to include religions like Judaism and Islam, maybe. But how does that become universal? Not everybody adhere to that religion. It re-establishes that the purpose of sex is reproduction. And this is a big one. This wording is fallacious wording. The function of sex is reproduction. If you have sex, as a result of it, we can have reproduction. That much is true. But there is no purpose to sex. And the problem with that is that when we talk about purpose, we are trying to assign a purpose to an evolutionary function, which fundamentally all the processes of biological evolution which happens through natural selection, we are a result of that, has no purpose. It is just a chain of cause and effect, a cycle of cause and effect, and we are a result of that. There is no purpose underlying to this. So the purpose of sex to reproduction is a completely fallacious statement. Then it says, if you're going to do women's rights and pronatalism, then you really have to work at managing the trade-offs here. And so at least that much the author recognizes, that women's rights and pronatalism have some conflicts within them, and you have to do some trade-offs. One clear implication of the change I have made to original commandment is that space exploration is good. Why is that good? Is not answered. The aim isn't just to fill up Earth and subdue it, but to fill up the solar system. And why? What are the boundaries? Nothing is defined. Finally, there is a clear win condition. So what he says is, there is a clear-cut, tangible goal to achieve, that you have to fill up the solar system. But there are two problems with that. One, it is not really tangible. What does it mean by fill up the solar system? What density of population across the solar system are you aiming at? Is it just all the humans occupying the entire solar system, which is unimaginable? It doesn't define what solar system means, what are the boundaries. It doesn't define why we should be doing that. And secondly, even if you sit down and define those terms, it doesn't explain why having a clear condition makes that particular goal a good goal. I can have a clear winning condition to kill somebody. That does not automatically make that goal a good goal. So these are some of the problems in this pro-natalist article. I wanted to bring this up because that is how generally the pro-natalist thinking is, and we need to see the gaps within them and point them out. There was a talk in Japanese language with the title Sustainability and Depopulation, What Drives Today's Antinatalism. And this is interesting because Japan has one of the lowest birth rates, and they're talking about antinatalism, sustainability, population in Japan as well. The talk seems to have started with the discussion on sustainability, then on to population control mechanisms, and then it goes into antinatalism. It refers to David Benatar's asymmetry. It seems that the speaker is explaining the various different arguments for antinatalism, including Benatar's asymmetry, the risk argument, and so on. What I did was I tried to download the transcript of the video and got it translated, but from the translation I could not really figure out exactly what the speaker's position was. Is this talk against antinatalism but for sustainability, or is this talk for antinatalism? And if it is, what kind of antinatalism? Is it only human-centric, sentiocentric? There was also reference to Childfree and so on. So I could not figure out exact positions of the speaker in this, but that much I could gather. So if anybody knows better Japanese, and if you could help me, please let me know. I would like to know what exactly was said in this talk. So there was a new video. Let's talk about antinatalism. Should we let the human race go extinct? By somebody called Jade Childfree Living. She seems to have a decent YouTube channel talking about child-free lifestyle. This video, I like this video very much. She made all the good points talking about antinatalism, and her main point about extinction, I want to say something on that. Let's just hear out what she's talking about extinction.
So many people procreate from a place of like, oh, I'm scared the human race is going extinct, so let me just add another human onto the planet. And they don't.
Now, I don't have any statistical evidence to prove this or to disprove this particular claim that people have children because they fear extinction of human race. But what I think is that, and it'll be interesting to see if there is any such study, but what I think, my subjective impression is that is not the reason why most people have children. What might be happening is that people want to have children and they do have children. Now, usually it is our human nature that whatever actions we do, that we want to do, we try and find external justifications to support that after we have done the actions. And to save humans from going extinction would be one of those justifications, just to justify your act of having children, which you're going to do anyway. That is probably what is happening. So that was one point. The other point, she has made all the very good arguments for antinatalism, but all throughout the video, I think what she's talking about is human-centric antinatalism only. There is another flavor, which is a broader flavor of antinatalism, which is sentiocentric antinatalism, which says that procreation or creation of any new sentient beings is not morally correct. So I think that aspect wasn't talked about. Maybe that wasn't in the scope of video, but that's one. And lastly, she also gives us a glance of some 60 reasons she herself has why she is child-free. And it looks like many of them are antinatalist reasons as well. So to me, it looks like her reasons, maybe she's taking the benefits of child-free lifestyle, and she should. Why should she not? But at the same time, her reasons to not have children, at least partly, are also antinatalist reasons. That brings me to the point that whether we should have clean categories of people between child-free and antinatalists. And I think the categories of these should be on the argument level and not on the level of people. The arguments for being child-free and the arguments for antinatalism can be set into two different categories fairly cleanly. Whereas people, there are overlaps. Some people are child-free and antinatalists. Some parents are antinatalists. Some people are child-free and are against antinatalism. And people like her who are child-free, who think that they are child-free, but are child-free for mainly antinatalist reasons. So there's a lot of overlap between the people. The categorization is only in the arguments. Overall, very good video. I like the video, and as you can see, I've already subscribed to the channel. So thanks for this content creator. Thank you to Jade. There was a sort of a debate, discussion between Lawrence and someone called McNally on the subject of antinatalism. Overall, it was a very interesting discussion to listen to. They spent first 41 minutes defining antinatalism, what it is and what it is not, and clearing out some distractions like environmental antinatalism, child freedom, and all of that. And then they go into the philosophical discussions about antinatalism. They discussed topics like caring for welfare of future generations versus not creating future generations in the first place. Consent argument was discussed, Benatar's axiological asymmetry and the other asymmetries around that were also discussed. Non-identity problem they talked about, and they also talked about faith-based versus logic-based beliefs or systems of beliefs. Now, I'm not going to respond to the entire video because that will take a long time, but I want to say something, not with the intention of criticizing Lawrence or showing that he was short of saying anything. He was absolutely fantastic there. This is only to supplement what Lawrence had said. And I know that it is easy to sit back and look at the entire conversation and then talk about it rather than responding to it at runtime, which Lawrence was doing. That is the case. I just want to say something which I think which will bolster some of the arguments for antinatalism from what Lawrence had said. One of the point was that at the end of the discussion, they actually started talking about the basic axioms on which this antinatalism or concept of antinatalism is founded upon, which is that suffering is bad, suffering is inherently bad, suffering is intrinsically bad. And this is something I feel like what happens with a lot of people. I'm not saying this happened with McNally, but I have seen this happening with a lot of people in general, that it is implied that suffering is inherently bad. It is so implicit that we don't generally explicitly say that out loud before starting talking about antinatalism. And then we finally reach the conclusion that, oh, based on this implicit assumption that suffering is inherently bad, we reach these conclusions that we should not have children and extinction is okay as a consequence of that. Then people start questioning that axiom, that is suffering really bad. They start going around it about, they first put an argument for instrumental value of suffering. then we say that no, that's instrumental value, and we accept that has a good value, that has a positive value, but intrinsically suffering is bad. And then people have reluctance to accept that axiom itself. Whereas in all of general lives, we generally act as if suffering is inherently bad. But even then, people start questioning that premise just because the conclusion eventually goes into an area which is not very palatable to most of the people. That is what happens. They discuss this at the end of the conversation, that suffering is bad, which is the basic axiom. If you don't agree on that, then it's a different discussion altogether than antinatalism. That's one point. The other point is Wolf McNally at one point talks about the universe as it exists and the things in it as they exist without any moral good or bad. Let's have a look at what he says, and then we'll try and answer that.
Nobody is able to consent to being born. And yet, the universe, is so constituted that people come into existence, and that itself, the coming into existence of the universe itself, or of people, or of the world, or whatever, is not morally good or bad. It's not morally anything. It just is. And then now, what we do with our minds, with our societies, with our laws, and so on, is emergent from that existence, and then we can start assigning, deontological, right and wrong, shouldn't, statements about it. But the idea of coming into existence, whether it's the Big Bang, bringing the whole universe into existence, or the creation of the planet, or the evolution of species, or the suffering of an antelope that's killed by a lion, or whatever, these things, or a lion having lion cubs, these things are all morally. It's incoherent to speak about them as moral good or bad, by itself.
So that is true, but I want to clarify a few points here. When he says moral good or bad, I think he means right or wrong, which he earlier he was referring to as deontological right or wrong. The process of doing that is that we first categorize events and things that happen in this world as good or bad by assigning the value to those things. For example, earthquake is bad. Earthquake just happens. There is nobody who causes generally the earthquake, but it is still bad. We assign a bad value, and you can go into argument of why we are saying that as bad, because it causes suffering, and then why is suffering bad. But generally, we assign a bad value, a negative value to events like earthquake. Now, not everything is as black and white and clear as good and bad, or as objective. For example, if lion eating a deer, is it a good or a bad thing? Well, it is good for the lion, it is bad for the deer. That is as simple as that. So there, this subjective element comes in. But what you can also do, and I'm not talking about right or wrong here, not moral good or bad, just good or bad. Okay. So what you can do in case of lion eating a deer is, you can come out of that system and look at that system from outside and think about whether this system can be thought of as good or bad for that individual lion or that individual deer in that system. A system in which a lion has to eat a deer, and a system in which a deer has to be eaten by a lion. Is that a good system for a lion or a deer to be in? If the lion doesn't eat, he is going to starve. He or she is going to starve because of food, and the deer is going to be dead because it is being killed. Is that a good system, looking from outside of the system, but from the perspective of the individuals within that system? And then you can see that this is not a good system to be in. And I think most evolutionary biologists also accept that this mechanism of natural selection and biological evolution is not a good mechanism for the individuals within it. It might look beautiful for us because we are not as affected as those individuals, but it is not a good thing looking from outside of the system from the perspective of those individuals within it. And that is the first step. That is the recognition that that system itself is a bad system. From then on, we can think about, derive what is right and what is wrong. Is the act of addition of a new individual into that system right or wrong, depending on whether that system itself is good or bad for the individuals within it? That is the argument of antinatalism, I think, rather than directly saying that, something is right or wrong in the nature. The other point was about a certain fallacy that Wolf McNally pointed out. Let's have a look at what that fallacy is.
It's incoherent to assign attributes to it. And something I keep see coming up in the antinatalism argument is the idea that coming into existence is a harm. The problem I have with that is that harm as a concept implies something that can be harmed, that preexists. If I, stab you right now, I'd be harming you, but you exist.
Yeah.
The coming into existence of is what causally needs to presuppose harm. And to say that coming to existence or bringing somebody into existence is a harm implies that they exist in this kind of platonic world of no harm, no suffering, no pain, that is kind of, this existence that precedes existence. But if you don't grant that there's this platonic pre-world, and I think in the Pixar movie Soul, they called it the U seminar, where all the souls are before they're introduced to Earth. If you don't grant the existence of something like that, then it seems to me logically incoherent to say that bringing something into existence is suffering. You could say bringing something into existence happens for sure, but then to start associating qualia with it, like it's a harm, seems to me it commits a fallacy of using a concept using a concept to undermine the concept. It's sometimes called the fallacy of the stolen concept. So I'm curious.
All right, so here this is the fallacy of stolen concept. Before we go into that, the part of bringing somebody into existence or coming into sentient existence, which is a semantic part, Lawrence addresses that very well. But the fallacy, I think, which Wolf McNally is trying to make is just the statement that sentient existence is a harm. That itself, he is saying, is a fallacy of stolen concept. Let's understand what the fallacy of stolen concept is. If there is a precondition for a concept to be proven, and if you deny the precondition as a proof for that concept, that is fallacy of stolen concept. Let's take an example. I'm going to take an example from Wikipedia. You can look it up. Let's take the statement, all property is theft. Now, the concept of theft is there has to be some owned, you can think of private property, but there has to be some owned property. There has to be some owner of some property, and somebody else takes that property away from that owner without that owner's consent. That is the concept of theft. So for us to prove theft, we have to accept a precondition that there exists a concept of property. But this statement that all property is theft is denying that precondition in the process of proving the concept of theft. That is an example of fallacy of stolen concept. How is that applied here? What Wolf McNally is trying to say is that sentient existence is a precondition for somebody to be harmed. And therefore, if you are saying that sentient existence is a harm, you are committing fallacy of stolen concept. And the first point is that we are not denying the precondition, we are not denying sentient existence to prove that it is harmful. That is point number one. Second point is this statement, sentient existence is a harm, is more of an empirical claim rather than a theoretical conceptual claim. Let me explain what I mean. Imagine that there exists some sentient being somewhere in transhumanist utopian dream which cannot suffer. It has capacity to suffer it because it is sentient, but that capacity is never invoked, and that sentient being is living in a perpetual bliss of continuous pleasure. What is the attitude of the antinatalist to this being? Now, this situation denies this statement that sentient existence is a harm because there exists a sentient being, but it is not harmful for that being. That existence itself is not harmful for that sentient being. What is the attitude of antinatalists towards these sentient beings? This, I think, was a question, if I remember this correctly, was asked on the podcast interview with Sam Harris to David Benatar. And David Benatar had said that if such sentient beings exists, we should be indifferent to them, which implies that we should also be indifferent to creation of such sentient beings because they are continuously experiencing pleasure. You can argue that what about if they, for some reason, at some point, don't experience a certain pleasure? Well, that's not bad because they cannot be deprived of those pleasures, because if they are, then they would suffer, and that is our assumption that they cannot suffer. And so therefore, we can very well be pretty much indifferent to the existence of these sentient beings and by implication creation of such sentient beings. So in that conceptual situation, That is okay. What we are talking is in the real world, the world that we live in, the universe that we live in, the way that it is structured, we cannot have a sentient being who has capacity to suffer and whose capacity will never be invoked, if it will not be invoked at all. We cannot have such a situation. We cannot even like see such a situation. So it is based on observation. This statement is an empirical statement that sentient existence always involves harm to that being. That being will always be harmed, because that capacity of that being to suffer will always be invoked eventually. That is the empirical part. Whereas the case of property, all property is a theft, is a conceptual statement. It is not an empirical statement. So that is a difference here. The last part I want to address on that part is that let's take a real world example of all property is a theft. So there is a diamond called Kohinoor diamond, and the history of that diamond has been that it has always been stolen from one king by another king. It has passed on from one king to another quite a few times in the course of the history. Right now it sits in one of those British museums where they display all the stolen goods of the world, and people pay money to just go and see that. I know that because I have done that. So that apart, this diamond has a history of stealing. All of it, you can trace the chain of stealing of that diamond. But eventually you would come to a point where there would be some person who would have found that diamond somewhere in the ground. Now you can make a rule that person, because that person was the first human being to find that diamond out of the earth, that person was the legitimate first owner of the diamond, and then whoever else stole that diamond from that person are all thieves, and rest of it is all theft. But the first instance is really the instance of legitimate property, and because it is an instance of legitimate property, you cannot say that all property is a theft. That is okay, but what do you do with that? What if you regard theft as a bad thing and you don't want theft to happen? There are two cases that what you can do with that. You can give all of the security possible in the world to that one person who actually legitimately owns that Kohinoor diamond, such that nobody else can steal it. That's one way, because that diamond already exists. Now we have to take care of that existing diamond so that nobody steals that. That's one way. Another way could be to say that it would have been better had that diamond not existed from the point of view of theft. Because if the diamond did not exist, nobody could have stolen that diamond. And you might say that this is futile. Now the diamond actually exists. But you can still say that it is still better that Kohinoor diamond 2.0 does not exist, because then nobody can steal that and theft cannot happen. Which implies that you should not create, if there ever is a possibility of creating Kohinoor diamond 2.0, you should not be doing that, because that creates a possibility of it being stolen, and we are saying that the act of stealing or theft is bad. That is the analogy, I think, which fits in for antinatalism.